Hello and welcome to Creating Disciples with me, Austin Roberts. Today we are going to be taking a look at a psalm. Psalms come from the songbook of the Bible, the Psalter, the book of Psalms. And we are excited to be looking at one today that is going to talk to us a little bit about despair and how we deal with those feelings that are so tough and so difficult. I don't know about you, but I have felt despair in my life before. And no doubt everybody has. For some, it's recent. For some, it's from a long time ago. For some, it may be even right now. But the truth is that throughout our lives, we will all feel crushed. We'll all feel despair sometime, somewhere. As I made my journey through Walla Walla University, where I got my undergraduate degree, I met a girl. Her name is Nicole, and today we are married. But back then, we were not. In fact, we were just friends, and we had hung out a little bit. We knew a lot of the same people, and we had the same group of friends. And after a while, I decided that I was interested. You see, we had spent a fair amount of time together, and we had talked a lot, and we had built a good friendship, and I thought that it was finally time, perhaps, to ask her out on a date. Well, as you can imagine, I was pretty nervous. I had not talked to her about anything along these lines to this point, and I wasn't sure if she would be willing to go or not. But I thought, I've got to do it sometime, so I decided to do it. I remember that she had taken a very difficult test, and I knew that test was coming, so I told her, hey, once you've taken that test, why don't we go out and celebrate, and I'm sure you'll do well. And so we'd gone out, and this wasn't a date yet. We'd gone out, and we'd gotten something to eat and gotten something to drink, and we were having a good time. And she was then driving me back to the dorm where I lived. I didn't have a car at that point, and she did. And so she was kind enough to take me back to where I lived. Well, we got back there, and I was gathering my things, my backpack, books, keys, and so forth. And I remember sitting there and thinking, well, this is the time. It's do or die, it's go big or go home. There is no time like the present. In fact, leading up to this day, I had been told on more than one occasion by more than one friend that I might as well go ahead and do it. You see, this was her last year at Walla Walla before she was going to go down to Loma Linda and begin her program in medicine. I still had 1 year to go after that year was finished, but by that time she'd be gone. And so there I was, gathering my things, knowing that this was really getting close to the end. Because there were only probably 6-7 months of school left. And it would already be difficult enough to start a relationship if that was where this was headed. So it was do or die time, I suppose. And so there I was. I've gathered my things, and I decided to do it. And I got out of the car, and I turned back around and looked into the car, and there she was sitting in the driver's seat. And I'm not 100% sure how I got these words out, or even what I said. But somehow I managed to stumble over myself enough times, and I said something along the lines of, Nicole, it would be great if, I think, maybe, you would go out on a date with me. And I don't remember, once again, exactly what I said, but I do remember that I got the word date out there. You see, I wanted her to know that I was serious about this. I wanted her to know that it was a date and that we weren't just going to hang out or do something fun. But I got the words out. And I will never in my life forget what happened next. She looked at me and she said, "Yeah, I'll go, but we need to talk." And I didn't know whether to be crushed or to be elated. So I made my way back into the dorm with those words still ringing in my ears. And I thought, oh man. And I began to think about this a little more. I didn't know why she had said what she had said. But as the scenarios turned over in my mind, I began to think, oh man, maybe she's just doing this out of pity. Maybe she is just giving me a courtesy date, and then at the end she'll tell me, I had a good time, and I hope you did too, but I'm not really interested, and so on and so forth. And it really began to dwell in my mind. The more I thought about it, the more discouraged I became. And I don't know if you've ever been there, a place where you feel crushed and destitute and you don't feel good, you feel in despair. But if you have ever been in that place, if you have ever stood in that situation, if you know what I'm talking about, to you I say, take courage, for you are not alone. In fact, there are many who have gone before you, and many no doubt who will come after you, who have been in a similar situation. Today we're going to open to the book of Psalms, Psalm 13 to be exact. And we're going to read this in its stanzas in a few moments. But let's talk about Psalm 13, a bit about the background here. So the first thing we know about Psalm 13 is that it is a psalm of David. Scholars and theologians know pretty much with absolute certainty that David wrote this psalm. Now, if we were to place this psalm in David's life, it would also likely be placed pretty early. This psalm was probably written before David was king, while he was still a kid, really, maybe while he was working in the house of Saul, but more likely while he was on the run from Saul. So this is when David was young, before he was king, and he wrote this psalm out of a place of despair. He wrote this psalm out of a place of being crushed. In fact, Warren Wiersbe, the author of the B commentary series, says this about this psalm. He says, God had promised David the throne of Israel, yet that day of coronation seemed further and further away. Saul was doing evil things, and God was not judging him, and yet David was doing good things and felt abandoned by the Lord. So that's the context into which we step. David has been a faithful individual. He has done what God has asked. He has been a good man. In fact, David has had more than one chance to kill Saul. If you remember the story back earlier in the Bible, there's a time when David sneaks up on Saul when he is asleep. And he could, right there, have ended Saul's life. Yet he does not do that. Instead, he takes a knife and cuts the corner of Saul's robe to prove to Saul the power that he had in that one fleeting moment. But David has been faithful. He refuses to kill the king because Saul is the Lord's anointed. And David says, no, I'm going to do this the right way. I'm going to do this the Lord's way. And yet, he is feeling crushed. He is feeling perhaps abandoned. So that is the context into which we step today. And we're going to read this in 3 stanzas. The first 2 will sound about right, and the third one, perhaps, will sound a bit off. But we'll get to that in a little bit. For now, let's read the first stanza. Psalm 13, verses 1 and 2. David writes, How long, Lord, will you forget me? How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts, and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? David certainly doesn't pull any punches. And here he asks what I would call a painful question. David is honest, straightforward, to the point. He asks a painful question. And it's clear what he's asking. He is asking, "Oh Lord, how long must I suffer?" He is struggling. He doesn't know perhaps what to do next, and he is dealing with Saul, and he's dealing with being on the run. He's dealing with the constant threat of harm or death. He knows what's coming. And he asks the Lord, "Oh Lord, how long?" A painful question. I don't know about you, but ever since I was a child, I try my best to avoid long car rides. There are many who enjoy road trips. There are many who enjoy driving across the state or across the country, but that is not my cup of tea by any stretch of the imagination. It's just not something I enjoy doing very much. But some people do. In fact, my threshold, I would say, is about 6 hours. That is about the longest amount of time that I like sitting in a car at one time and not doing anything. But there was a time, I remember, it was the end of my first or second year at Walla Walla University, the end of my second year. And I had to come back home to Loma Linda. And the drive from Walla Walla to Loma Linda is 18 to 20 hours if you go the fastest way and do it in one shot. And I remember thinking, oh boy, this is going to be a long, long day. But I had a good friend by the name of John, and John and I were going to drive this drive. So we got up at about 6 in the morning and began the drive. Well, we were driving for a long time. And if you know the geography of the western United States, and you know the fastest way to go, you begin there in Walla Walla, and then you go south. And you go south, and you go through Oregon, and you keep going. You kind of hit Idaho there a little bit. And then you get into the great state of Nevada. Now, Nevada is an empty, 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 empty place. And as you drive through there, there is nothing. In fact, there are probably about 200 miles between gas stations. So when you're driving, you have to fill up every single gas station lest you risk sitting out there. And that could be very, very dangerous because it gets very hot out there in June and it could end you, honestly. But there we were on the drive. We're driving through Nevada, and I remember hitting about hour 8, 9, 10, and I began to get really tired of this drive. But we were there driving, and as we kept going, I realized that we were only about halfway through this drive. We had just the same amount of time we'd just driven left to go. And I thought, my goodness, I don't know if I am ever going to make it through this. So, naturally, I began to play this little game with myself. I would be sitting there in the car, and I would look at the clock. I'd look at the time and think, okay. And then I would intentionally look away from the clock and not look at it, and just do everything I could to not see that clock. And there it would roll, and I would be talking to John, be reading things on my phone, be doing whatever. And the clock would roll second by second, minute by minute. And after a while, I would kind of build up the courage and think, okay, I'm going to look at this clock. But before I do, I'm going to guess how much time has gone by. And so I'd sit there and think, okay, 45 minutes maybe, 50 minutes. If I'm lucky, an hour. So I'd sit there for another couple of seconds. And finally, I look at the clock. 20 minutes? That's it? I've been sitting here for days on end on this godforsaken road, and it's only been 20 minutes since I last looked at this clock? Come on. How long could this go on? And David sits there as he pens this poem to God, and he asks, "Oh Lord, how long?" In fact, he doesn't ask how long once or twice or even 3 times. David says how long 4 times there in that first stanza. How long, how long, how long, how long, Lord, will this continue? How long? But then there's a second stanza. And after David asks a painful question, he then has a persistent plea. And so we're going to read Psalm 13, verses 3 and 4 now, and see what David has to say. David writes, "Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall." And so David has a persistent plea. He says, "Answer me, O God. Give light to my eyes. I will die if you do not." So here we have a persistent plea. And the main thing I think David is asking for here is light in the darkness. Now, a question I would pose to you here is, have you ever been in a place where it is dark, very dark? And when I say dark, I mean true and honest darkness, no light. Now, there are places where it's dark, but what I mean is different. You see, I don't mean when you're going to bed and you turn the lights off. And it takes, a minute or two for your eyes to adjust, but eventually you can make out the outline of the door of the bathroom, of your nightstand. You can see your phone sitting there on the table. Not that dark. And I don't mean the type of darkness it is when you go outside at night. You go out and you can't really see anything, but eventually after standing there for a few minutes, your eyes adjust. You can see the road, you can see the houses, you can see the trees. Even with the moonlight and the stars, you can kind of see things. What I mean is true and honest darkness. A few years ago, some church members of mine were kind enough to take me on a camping trip. And we had a good time. We were up in Calaveras County in California. And we're out there camping for a few days. We had a good time, ate good food, had good conversation, played fun games. And one of the highlights of the trip for me was going to Mercer Caverns. And I don't know if you have ever been there, but if you have not, I would say to you, well, go if you ever have the chance. It's a fun experience. It's cool to go down there. And so we went to Mercer Caverns, and we got there, we got to the front, we paid the entrance fee, got the ticket, waited for the tour, and then we made our way down into this cavern. And the tour guide told us about the cavern itself, told us about its discovery, the people who discovered it, the exploration that's been done down into this enormous cave. And it was fun. We had a good time. We saw great rock formations, cool things that I hadn't seen before. And finally, we got to the halfway point of the tour, and we made the turn and began to climb the steps back up. And then we got to a part of the tour that I had not anticipated. And the tour guide said, okay, everyone stand in one place, grab onto a railing so you don't fall. And what I'm going to do, he said, is I am going to turn off the lights. And you are going to experience true darkness. So we waited there for a second. We were ready. And then he flipped the switch and turned it off. And let me tell you, it was dark. And I stood there, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited. It must have been probably only a couple minutes, but it felt a little longer than that. And I just kept waiting for my eyes to adjust. I waved my hand in front of my face. I tried to get close to the rocks to see, and I could not see a thing. Well, after a couple minutes, the tour guide turned the lights back on, and then he began to talk about the darkness in there. And he said, well, what you experienced here is real darkness, he said. You see, because of the twists and the turns in this cave, light from the sun never actually reaches here. So this part of the cave has never seen the sun. In fact, he said, if you were to be down here with the lights off, after about a couple of weeks, you would begin to go blind because of the disuse of your eyes. That's how dark it is. And I thought, whew, that is dark. And David here says, Lord, I am surrounded by the darkness. Give me a light. And he has this persistent plea. And he says, Lord, come on. So first he's had a painful question, how long, O Lord? And second, he transitions into a persistent plea. Lord, light the way, the path. It is dark. But now we're going to move into the third stanza in Psalm 13. And it is a stanza, perhaps, that might feel a little out of place at first. It doesn't feel quite right. And the way I would summarize this stanza would be with these words. He gives a joyful praise. So it's not something negative this time. He kind of changes gears, switches directions. And so let's read what David says here in Psalm 13, verses 5 and 6. David writes, "But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me." And we kind of sit here and think, really, David? You've asked a painful question, you've given a persistent plea, and now you switch things up to a joyful praise? What gives? It's a bit of a strange twist, is it not? The story is told in the devotional Our Daily Bread of John Wesley, who is one of the founders of the Methodist Church denomination. When Wesley was young, he was apparently a bit ornery, a bit sarcastic, maybe even a bit disrespectful. But the story is told of Wesley meeting a porter one day, and as they had conversation, Wesley came to realize that this porter was very poor. He only had one coat, he had no place to lay his head, nowhere to sleep, yet he was joyful. He was very happy. And so he was continually praising God and giving thanks. And Wesley asked him with a bit of our sarcastic touch, well, what else do you thank the Lord for today? And to Wesley's surprise, the porter responded by saying, well, I have this life, this wonderful life I live to thank God for today. It is said that that moment in Wesley's life was a turning point in the person he was. He had been sarcastic, ornery, disrespectful even, and then he became a follower of Christ. He thought, wow, if someone who is in such a situation as this can give praise and give thanks to God, so can I. Many, many years later, when Wesley was on his deathbed at the age of 88, as he was drawing his last breaths, he would be lying there singing hymns to God. I will praise him while I have breath. And I guess the truth is that David does something here that at first glance, while it may seem unexpected, is really the right thing to do. He praises God despite being down and in the dumps, does David. He's got much to be thankful for. You see, he has something called hope. As the great theologian and founder of Protestantism as a whole, likely, Martin Luther, says, while hope despairs, despair hopes. And that's what David has. He has hope. So while he sits here in what must feel despairing and what must feel high pressure, he has hope. And he praises God. And that's not to say that he's not honest, because he is in this psalm. He cries out, he asks God, oh, how long will this be? And then he gives a persistent plea and says, God, light my path. Take away this darkness. But then at the end here, he is hopeful. He praises God for the things God has already given him and the things God will continue to give to him. You know, the truth is, I was hopeful. Even after Nicole had said, yeah, I'll go, but we have to talk, I was hopeful that things would turn out. And so, we did end up going on that date. And we ate great food at a little place there in Walla Walla. And then we went to this little dessert place and had a great dessert. And so I asked her, I said, well, what was it that you meant? What do we need to talk about? And she said, oh, yes, I remember. She said that what she wanted to talk about was just to make sure I was serious. She had had some experiences previously with some other people that didn't go so well. And she just wanted to know if this date was just for fun or if it could potentially lead to something more later on down the road. And I don't blame her. I would want to know the answer to the same question. And so I answered, and I said, well, I would like to get to know you more, of course, but I do hope there is some potential down the road. And in that moment, I gave her hope, and she gave me hope, and I guess you could say the rest is history. And so to each of us today, it is all right to ask God hard questions, to ask God a painful question, and to give God a persistent plea, but then you cannot forget to give a joyful praise. For he is watching out over you and over me, and these things are in his timing, regardless of how difficult that may feel. So thank you for joining us today on Creating Disciples. We hope the Lord has blessed you greatly, and no doubt he will go with you wherever you go. And we hope you join us again next time.